It gave one the impression of the Venus of Milo in chocolate pyjamas. It was nude at first, said the landlord, but the neighbourhood is hardly educated up to art and objected, so I gave it that brown paint. On one expedition, the artistic house hunter was accompanied by Euphemia. Then it was he found Hillcrest, a vast edifice at the incredible rent of £40 a year, with which a megathral key was identified. It took the two of them, not to mention an umbrella, to turn this key. The rent was a mystery, and while they were in the house, a thunderstorm kept them there some time. They tried to imagine the murder. From the top windows they could see the roofs of the opposite houses in plan.
"I wonder how long it would take to get to the top of the house from the bottom,"
said Euphemia. "Certainly longer than we could manage every day," said the artistic house hunter. "Fancy looking for my pipe in all these rooms. Starting from the top bedroom at the usual time, I suppose one would arrive downstairs to breakfast about 11, and then we should have to be getting upstairs again by 8 o'clock if we wanted any night's rest worth having. Or we might double or treble existence, live a gargantuan life to match the house, make our day of 48 hours instead of 24. By doubling everything, we should not notice the hole it made in our time getting about the place. Perhaps by making dinner last twice as long, eating twice as much, and doing everything on the scale of 2 to 1, we might adapt ourselves to our environment in time, grow twice as big."
"Then we might be very comfortable here,"
said Euphemia. They went downstairs again. By that time it was thundering and raining heavily. The rooms were dark and gloomy. The big side door, which would not shut unless locked from the outside, swayed and banged as the gusts of wind swept round the house. But they had a good time in the front kitchen, playing cricket with an umbrella, and the agent's order crumpled into a ball. Presently, the artistic house hunter lifted Euphemia onto the tall dresser, and they sat there, swinging their feet patiently until the storm should leave off and release them.
"I should feel, in this kitchen,"
said Euphemia,
"like one of my little dolls must have felt in the doll's house kitchen I had once. The top of her head just reached the level of the table. There were only 4 plates on the dresser, but each one was about half her height across."
"Your reminiscences are always entertaining," said the artistic house hunter. "Still they fail to explain the absolving mystery of this house being to let at £40 a year." The problem raised his curiosity, but though he made inquiries, he found no reason for the remarkably low rent or the continued emptiness of the house. It was a specimen puzzle for the house hunter. A large house with a garden of about half an acre, and with accommodation for about 6 families, going begging for £40 a year. Would it let at 80? Some such problem, however, turns up in every house hunt, and it is these surprises that give the sport its particular interest and delight, always provided the mind is not unsettled by any ulterior notion of settling down. Of blades and bladery. The blade is not so much a culture as a temperament, and bladery, if the thing may have the name, a code of sentiments rather than a ritual. It is the Rococo school of behaviour, the flamboyant gentleman, the gargoyle life. The blade is the tribute innocent pays to vice. He may look like a devil and belong to a church. And the clothing of the blade, being symbolical, is a very important part of him. It must show not only a certain tastiness, but also decision in the accent, courage in the pattern, and a Dudley hardihood of outline. A blade must needs take the colour of his social standing, but all blades have the same essential qualities, and all blades have this quality, that they despise and contemn other blades from the top downward. But where the bottommost blade comes, no man can tell. A well-bred blade, though he be a duke, tends to wear his hat tilted a little over the right eyebrow, and a piece of hair is pulled coquettishly down just below the brim. His collar is high, and a very large bow is worn slightly askew. This may be either cream-coloured or deep blue, with spots of white, or it may be red or buff, but not green, because of badinage. The blade of the middle class displays a fine gold watch chain, and his jacket and vest may be of a rough black cloth or blue serge. The trousering may be of a suit with the jacket, or tasteful, and the shoes must be long. The betting man adorned is a perfect blade. There is often a large and ornamental stick, which is invariably carried head downwards, and note that the born blade instinctively avoids any narrowness of pose. Walking, he thrusts out his shoulders, elbows, and knees, and it is rather the thing to dominate a sphere of influence beyond this by swinging his stick. At first, the beginner will find this weapon a little apt to slip from the hand and cause inconvenience to the general public. But he must not mind that. After a few such misadventures, he will acquire dexterity. All blades smoke, publicly at least. To smoke a white meerschaum in the streets, however, is very inferior form. The proper smoking is a briar, and remember, it is not smart to have a new pipe. So soon as he buys it, the blade takes his pipe home, puts it on a glowing fire to burn the rim, scrapes this away, burns it again, and so on until it looks like a sullen desperado of a pipe with a wild past. Sometimes he cannot smoke a pipe. In this case, he may, for his stomach's sake, smoke a cigarette. And, besides, there is something cynical about a cigarette. For the very young blade, there are certain makes of cigarette that burn well. They are mixed with nitre, and these may be smoked by holding them in the left hand and idly swinging them to and fro in the air. If it were not for the public want of charity, I would recommend a well-known brand. A blade may always escape a cigar by feigning a fastidious taste. None of your cabinets is rather good style. The blade, it must be understood, especially by the blade's friends, spends his time in a whirl of dissipation. That is, the symbolism of the emphatic obliquity of the costume. First, he drinks. The blade at Harrow, according to a reliable authority, drinks cherry brandy and even champagne. Other blades consume whisky and soda. The less costly kind of blade does it on beer. And here the beginner is often at a loss. Let us say he has looked up the street and down, ascertained that there are no ants in the air, and then plunged into his first public house. How shall he ask for his liquor? "I will take a glass of ale, if you please, miss," seems tame for a blade. It may be useful to know a more suitable formula. Just at present, we may assure the blade neophyte it is all the rage to ask for 2 of swipes, ducky. Go in boldly, bang down your money as loudly as possible, and shout that out at the top of your voice. If it is a barman, though, you had better not say ducky. The slang will, we can assure him, prove extremely effective. Then the blade gambles, but over the gambling of the blade it is well to draw a veil, a partially translucent and coquettish veil, through which we can see the thing dimly and enhanced in its enormity. You must patronise the turf, of course, and have money on horses, or you are no blade at all, but a mere stick. The Harrow blade has his book on all the big races in the calendar, and the great and noble game of Nap. Are not blades its worshippers wherever the sun shines and a pack of cards is obtainable? Baccarat too. Many a glorious blade has lost his whole term's pocket money at a single sitting at that noble game. And the conversation of the blade must always be brilliant in the extreme, like the flashing of steel in the sunlight. It is usually cynical and worldly, sometimes horrible enough to make a governess shudder, but always epigrammatic. Epigrams and neat comparisons are much easier to make than is vulgarly supposed. Schoolmasters hang about the crops of knowledge like dead crows about a field. Examples and warnings to greedy souls. Marriage is the beginning of philosophy, and the end is, do not marry. All women are constant, but some discover mistakes. One is generally repentant when one is found out, and remorseful when one can't do it again. A little practice and this kind of thing may be ground out almost without thinking. Occasionally, in your conversation with ladies, you may let an oath slip. Better not let your aunt hear you. Apologise, humbly at once, of course, but it will give them a glimpse of the lurid splendour of your private life. And that brings us to the central thing of the blade's life, the eternal feminine. Pity them, be a little sorry for them. The poor souls cannot be blades. They must sit and palpitate while the blade flashes. The accomplished blade goes through life looking unspeakable wickedness at everything feminine he meets, old and young, rich and poor, one with another. He reeks with intrigue. Every blade has his secrets and mysteries in this matter, remorse even for crimes. You do not know all that his handsome face may hide. Even he does not know. He may have sat on piers and talked to shop girls, kissed housemaids, taken barmaids to music halls, conversed with painted wickedness in public places. Nothing is too much for him. And oh, the reckless protestations of love he has made, the broken promises, the broken hearts. Yet men must be blades, though women may weep, and every blade must take his barmaid to a music hall at least once, even if she be taller than himself. Until then, his manhood is not assured. Just one hint in conclusion. A blade who collects stamps, or keeps tame rabbits, or eats sweets, oranges, or apples in the streets, or calls names publicly after his friends, is no blade at all, but a boy still. So, with our blessing, he swaggers on his way, and is gone. A Don Juan, as fresh as spring, a rosebud desperado. May he never come upon just cause for repentance. Of cleverness, apropos of one Crichton. Crichton is an extremely clever person, abnormally, indeed almost unnaturally so. He is not merely clever at this or that, but clever all round. He gives you no consolations. He goes about being needlessly brilliant. He caps your jests and corrects your mistakes and does your special things over again in newer and smarter ways. Any really well-bred man who presumes so far would at least be plain or physically feeble, or unhappily married by way of an apology. But the idea of so much civility seems never to have entered Crichton's head. He will come into a room where we are jesting perhaps, and immediately begin to flourish about less funny perhaps, but decidedly more brilliant jests, until at last we retire one by one from the conversation and watch him with savage, wary eyes over our pipes. He invariably beats me at chess. Invariably. People talk about him and ask my opinion of him, and if I venture to criticize him, they begin to look as though they thought I was jealous. Grossly favourable notices of his books and his pictures crop up in the most unlikely places. Indeed, I have almost given up newspapers on account of him. Yet, after all, the cleverness is not everything. It never pleases me, and I doubt sometimes if it pleases anyone. Suppose you let off some clever little thing, a subtlety of expression, a paradox, an elusive, suggestive picture. How does it affect ordinary people? Those who are less clever than yourself, the unspecialized, unsophisticated, average people, are simply annoyed by the puzzle you set them. Those who are cleverer find your cleverness mere obvious stupidity, and your equals, your competitors in cleverness, are naturally your deadly rivals. The fact is, this cleverness, after all, is merely egotism in its worst and unwisest phase. It is an incontinence of brilliance, graceless and aggressive, a glaring swagger. The drunken helot of cleverness is the creature who goes about making puns. A mere step above the epigram, the isolated epigram, framed and glazed. Then such impressionist art as Crichton's pictures, mere puns in paint. What they mean is nothing. They arrest a quite decent-minded man like myself with the same spasmodic disgust as a pun in literature. The subject is a transparent excuse. They are mere indecent and unedifying exhibitions of himself. He thinks it is something superlative to do everything in a startling way. He cannot even sign his name without being offensive. He lacks altogether the fundamental quality of a gentleman, the magnanimity to be commonplace. On the score of personal dignity, why should a young man of respectable antecedents and some natural capacity stoop to this kind of thing? To be clever is the last desperate resort of the feeble. It is the merit of the ambitious slave. You cannot conquer vi armus. You cannot stomach a decent inferiority. So you resort to lively, eccentric, and brain-wearying brilliance to ingratiate yourself. The cleverest animal by far is the monkey, and compare that creature's undignified activity with the mountainous majesty of the elephant. And I cannot help thinking, too, that cleverness must be the greatest obstacle a man can possibly have in his way upward in the world. One never sees really clever people in positions of trust, never widely influential or deeply rooted. Look, for instance, at the Royal Academy, at the judges, But there, the very idea of cleverness is an all-round readiness and looseness that is the very negation of stability. Whenever Crichton has been particularly exasperating, getting himself appreciated in a new quarter, or rising above his former successes, I find some consolation in thinking of my uncle Augustus. He was the glory of our family. Even Aunt Charlotte's voice drooped a little in the mention of his name. He was conspicuous for an imposing and even colossal stupidity. He rose to eminence through it, and, what is more, to wealth and influence. He was as reliable, as unlikely to alter his precise position or do anything expected as the pyramids of Egypt. I do not know any topic upon which he was not absolutely uninformed, and his contributions to conversation, delivered in that ringing baritone of his, were appallingly dull. Often I have seen him utterly flatten some cheerful, clever person of the Crichton type with one of his simple garden roller remarks, plain, solid, and heavy, which there was no possibility either of meeting or avoiding. He was very successful in argument, and yet he never fenced. He simply came down. It was, so to speak, a case of small sword versus the avalanche. His moral inertia was tremendous. He was never excited, never anxious, never jaded. He was simply massive. Cleverness broke upon him like shipping on an iron-bound coast. His monument is like him, a plain, large obelisk of coarse granite, unpretending in its simple ugliness and prominent a mile off. Among the innumerable little white sorrows of the cemetery, it looks exactly as he used to look among clever people. Depend upon its cleverness is the antithesis of greatness. The British Empire, like the Roman, was built up by dull men. It may be we shall be ruined by clever ones. Imagine a regiment of lively and eccentric privates. There never was a statesman yet who had not some ballast of stupidity, and it seems to me that part at least of the essentials of a genius is a certain divine dullness. The people we used to call the masters, Shakespeare, Raphael, Milton, and so forth, had a certain simplicity Crichton lacks. They do not scintillate nearly so much as he does, and they do not give that same uncomfortable feeling of internal strain. Even Homer nods. There are restful places in their work, broad meadows of breezy flatness, calms, but Crichton has no Pacific Ocean to mitigate his everlasting weary passage of Cape Horn. It is all point and prominence, point and prominence. No doubt this Crichton is having a certain vogue now, but it cannot last. I wish him no evil, of course, but I cannot help thinking he will presently have had his day. This epoch of cleverness must be very near its last flare. The last and the abiding thought of humanity is peace. A dull man will presently be sought like the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. Dullness will be the new genius. "Give us dull books," a people will cry. "Bright, dull, restful pictures. We are weary, very weary." This hectic, restless, incessant phase in which we travail fin de siècle, decadent, and all the rest of it will pass away. A chubby, sleepy literature, large in aim, colossal in execution, rotund and tranquil, will lift its head. And this Crichton will become a classic Messrs. Moody will sell surplus copies of his work at a reduction, and I shall cease to be worried by his disgusting success. The Pose Novel. I watched the little spurts of flame jet out from between the writhing pages of my manuscript, watched the sheets coil up in their fiery anguish and start from one another. I helped the fire to the very victuals of the mass by poking the brittle heap, and at last the sacrifice was over. The flames turned from pink to blue and died out. The red glow gave place to black. Little luminous red streaks coiled around the charred sheets and vanished at the margins, and only the ashes of my inspiration remained. The ink was a lustrous black on the dull blackness of the burnt paper. I could still read this much of my indiscretion remaining. He smiled at them all and said nothing. "Fool," I said, and stirred the crackling mass into a featureless heap of black scraps. Then, with my chin on my fists and elbows on knees, I stared at the end of my labours. I suppose, after all, there has been some profit out of the thing. Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do, and one may well thank heaven it was only a novel. Still, it means many days out of my life, and I would be glad to find some positive benefit accruing. Clearly, in the first place, I have eased my mind of some execrable English. I am cleaner now by some dozen faulty phrases that I committed and saw afterwards in all the nakedness of typewriting. Thank heaven for typewriting. Were it not for that, this thing had gone to the scoffing of some publisher's reader, and another had known my shame. And I shall not write another Poe's novel. I am inclined to think these Poe's novels the wild oats of authorship. We sit down in the heyday of our youth to write the masterpiece. Obviously, it must be a novel about a man and a woman, and something as splendid as we can conceive of in that way. We look about us. We do not go far for perfection. One of the brace holds the pen, and the other is inside his or her head, and so off to the willing pen. Only a few years ago we went slashing among the poppies with a walking stick, and we said boldly and openly, Harolds and Hectors, slaying our thousands. Now, of course, we are grown up to self-respect, and must needs to be a little disingenuous about it. But as the story unfolds, there is no mistaking the likeness in spite of the transfiguration. This bold, decided man, who performs such deeds of daring-do in the Neunzen slum, knocks down the burly wife-beater, rescues an unmistakable Miss Clapton from the knife of Lascar, and is all the while cultivating a virtuous consumption that stretches him on an edifying, pathetic, and altogether beautiful deathbed in the last chapter. My dear authorling, cry, my friends, we hear the speak of that little voice of yours in every word he utters. Is that what you aspire to be? That twopence-coloured edition of yourself? Heaven defend you from your desires. Yes, there was a singular fascination in writing the book. To be in anticipation my own sympathetic historian. To joy with my joys yet to come, and sorrow with my sorrows. To bear disaster like a man, and at last to close my own dear eyes, and with a swelling heart write my own epitaph. The pleasure remained with me until I reached the end. How Admirably I strutted in front of myself, and I and the better self of me that was flourishing about in the book, we pretended not to know each other for what we were. He was myself with a wig and a sham visiting card, and I owed it to myself to respect my disguise. I made him with very red hair. My hair is fairly dark, and shifted his university from London to Cambridge. Clearly it could not be the same person, I argued. But I endowed him with all the treasures of myself. I made him say all the good things I might have said had I thought of them opportunely, and all the noble thoughts that occurred to me afterwards occurred to him at the time. He was myself at a premium, myself without any drawbacks, the quintessence and culmination of me. And yet, somehow, when he came back from the typewriter, he seemed a bit of an ass. Probably every tadpole author writes a pose novel. At least I hope so, for the sake of my self-respect. Most, after my fashion, burn the thing, or benevolent publishers lose it. It is an ill thing if by some accident the tadpole tale survives the tadpole stage. The authoress does the feminine equivalent, but I should judge either that she did it more abundantly, or else that she burned less. Has she never swept past you with a scornful look, disdained you in all the pride of her beauty, ripped laughter at you, or amazed you with her artless girlishness? And even after the early stages, some of the trick may survive, unless I read books with malice instead of charity. I must confess, though, that I have a weakness for finding mine author among his puppets. I conceive him always taking the best parts, like an actor-manager or a little boy playing with his sisters. I do not read many novels with sincere belief, and I like to get such entertainment from them as I can, so that these artless little self-revelations are very sweet and precious to me among all the lay figures, tragedy and comedy. Since the deception is transparent, I make the most of the transparency, and love to see the clumsy fingers on the strings of the marionettes. And this will be none the less pleasant now that I have so narrowly escaped giving this entertainment to others. I suppose this stage is a necessary one. We begin with ignorance and the imagination, the material of the pose novel. Later come self-knowledge, disappointments, and self-consciousness, and the prodigals of fiction stay themselves upon the husks of epigram and cynicism, and in the place of artless aspiration are indeed, in plain black and white, very desperate characters. It is, after all, only another pose, the pose of not posing. We, the common clay of the world of letters, must needs write in this way because we cannot forget our foolish little selves in our work. But some few there are who sit as gods above their private universes and write without passion or vanity. At least, so I have been told. These be the true artists of letters, the white windows upon the truth of things. We, by comparison, are but stained glass in our own honour, and do but obstruct the view with our halos and attitudes. Yet even Shakespeare, the critics tell us, and they say they know, posed in the character of Hamlet. After all, the pose novel method has at times attained to the level of literature. Charlotte Bronte might possibly have found no other topic had she disdained the plain little woman with a shrewish tongue. And where had Charles Kingsley been if the vision of a curate rampant had not rejoiced his heart? Still, I am not sorry that this novel is burned. Even now it was ridiculous, and the time might have come when this book, full of high, if foolish aims, and the vain, vast promise of well-meaning youth, had been too keen a reproach to be endured. 3 volumes of good intentions. It is too much. There was more than a novel burning just now. After this, I shall be in a position to take a humorous view of life. The Veteran Cricketer. My old cricketer was seized, he says, some score of years ago now, by sciatica, clutched indeed about the loins thereby, and forcibly withdrawn from the practice of the art. Since when a certain predisposition to a corpulent habit has lacked its natural check of exercise, and a broadness almost Dutch has won upon him. Were it not for this, which renders his contours and his receding aspect unseemly, he would be indeed a venerable-looking person, having a profile worthy of a patriarch, tinged though it may be with an unpatriarchal jollity and a close curly beard like that of King David. He lives by himself in a small cottage outside the village, hating women with an unaccountable detestation, and apparently earns a precarious livelihood, and certainly the sincere aversion of the countryside, by umpiring in matches and playing whist and nap with such as will not be so discreet and economical as to bow before his superior merit. His neighbours do not like him, because he will not take their cricket or their whist seriously, because he will persist in offering counsel and the stimulus of his gift of satire. All whist than his, he avers, is bumble puppy. His umpiring is pedagogic in tone. He fails to see the contest in the game. To him, who has heard his thousands roar as the bales of the best of all England went spinning, these village matches are mere puerile exercises to be corrected. His corrections, too, are Olympian, done, as it were, in red ink, vivid, and without respect of persons. Particularly, he jibes. He never uses vulgar bad language himself, but has a singular power of engendering it in others. He has a word, Gabby, which he will sometimes enlarge to stupid Gabby, the which, flung neatly into a man who has just missed a catch, will fill the same with a whirl of furious curses difficult to restrain. And, if perchance one should escape, my ancient cricketer will be as startled as Cadmus at the crop he has sown. And not only startled, but pained at human wickedness and the follies of a new generation. "Why can't you play without swearing, Master Gibbs?" he will say, catching the whispered hope 20 yards away and proclaiming it to a censorious world. And so Gibbs, our grocer and draper, and one made much of by the vicar, is shamed before the whole parish, and damned even as he desired. To our vicar, a well-meaning, earnest, and extremely nervous man, he displays a methodical antagonism. Our vicar is the worst of all possible rural vicars, unripe, a glaring modern, no classical scholar, no lover of nature, offensively young and yet not youthful, an indecent politician. He was meant to labour amid urban myriads, to deal with social evils, home rule, the woman question, and the reunion of Christendom, attend conferences, and go with the Weltgeist, damn him, wherever the Weltgeist is going. He presents you jerkily, a tall, lean man of aesthetic visage and ample garments, a soul clothed not so much in a fleshy body as in black flaps that ever trail behind its energy. Where they made him, heaven knows. No university owns him. It may be he is a renegade, dissenting minister, neither good church nor wholesome nonconformity. Him my cricketer regards with malignant respect he shows by a punctilious touching of his hat brim directed to the sacred office. All the rest is malignity, and aimed at the man that fills it. They come into contact on the cricket field and on the committee of our reading room. For our vicar, in spite of a tendency to myopia, conceives it is his duty to encourage cricket by his participation. Duty? To encourage cricket? So figure the scene to yourself. The sunlit green, and a match in progress. The ball has just snipped a stump askew. My ancient, leaning on a stout cabbage stick, and with the light overcoat that is sacred to umpires upon his arm. "Out, Billy Duggan," says he, and adds ex cathedra, and "one you ought to hit for 4. Then appears our vicar in semi-cannicles, worn to keep up his position, or some such folly, nervous about the adjustment of his hat and his eyeglasses. He approaches the pitch, smiling the while to show his purely genial import and to anticipate and explain any amateurish touches. He reaches the wicket and poses himself as the convenient book he has studied directs. "You'll be caught, Master Shackleford, if you keep your shoulder up like that," says the umpire. "Yep, that's worse," forgetting himself in a zeal for attitude, and then a voice cries, "Play!" The vicar swipes wildly, cuts the ball for 2, and returns to his wicket breathless but triumphant. Next comes a bye, and then over. The misguided cleric, ever pursuing a theory of foolish condensation to his betters at the game, and to show there is no offence at the yaps, takes the opportunity, although panting, of asking my ancient if his chicks, late threatened with staggers, are doing well. What would he think if my cricketer retaliated by asking, in the pause before the sermon, how the vicarage pony took his last bolus? The two men do not understand one another. My cricketer waves the hens aside and revenges himself, touching his hat at intervals by some offensively obvious remarks as to a mere beginner about playing with a straight bat. And the field sniggers none too furtively. I sympathise with his malice. Cricket is an altogether too sacred thing to him to be tampered with on merely religious grounds. However, our vicar gets himself caught at the first opportunity, and so being removed from my veterans' immediate environment, to their common satisfaction, the due ritual of the great game is resumed. My ancient cricketer abounds in reminiscence of the glorious days that have gone for ever. He can still recall the last echoes of the throwing controversy that agitated Nyren when overarm bowling began. And though he never played himself in a beaver hat, he can, he says, recollect seeing matches so played. In those days, everyone wore tall hats. The policeman, the milkman, workmen of all sorts. Some people, I fancy, must have bathed in them and gone to bed wearing them. He recalls the titans of that and the previous age, and particularly delights in the legend of Noah Man, who held it a light thing to walk 20 miles from North Chapel to Hamilton to practice every Tuesday afternoon and wander back after dark. He himself, as a stripling, would run a matter of 4 miles after a day's work in the garden where he was employed to attend an hour's practice over the downs before the twilight made the bulls invisible. And afterwards came Teutonic revelry or wanderings under the summer starlight, as the mood might take him, for there was a vein of silent poetry in the youth of this man. He hates your modern billiard table pitch and a battling of dexterous snickery. He likes character in a game. Gigantic hitting forward, bowler-planned leg catches, a cunning obliquity in a wicket that would send the balls mysteriously askew. But dramatic breaks are now a thing unknown in trade cricket. One legend of his, I doubt. He avers that one at Brighton, in a match between Surrey and Sussex, he saw 7 wickets bowled by some such aid in 2 successive overs. I have never been able to verify this. I believe that, as a matter of fact, the thing has never occurred, but he tells it often in a fine crescendo of surprise, and the refrain, "Out he came!" His first beginning is a cheerful anecdote of a crew of young gentlemen from Cambridge staying at the big house, and a challenge to the rustic talent of me and Billy Hall, who played a bit at that time, of me and Billy Hall winning the pitch and going in first, of a memorable, if uncivil, stand at the wickets through a long, hot afternoon. And a number of young gentlemen from Cambridge painfully discovering local talent by exhaustive fielding in the park, a duty they honourably discharged. I am fond of my old cricketer, in spite of a certain mendacious and malign element in him. His yarns of gallant stands and unexpected turns of fortune, of memorable hits and eccentric umpiring, all being tending sometimes incredibly to his glory, are full of the flavour of days well spent, of bright mornings of play, sunlit sprawlings beside the score tent, warmth, the flavour of bitten grass stems, and the odour of crushed turf. One seems to hear the clapping hands of village ancients and their ululations of delight. One thinks of stone jars with cool drink swishing therein, of shouting victories and memorable defeats of 11 men in a drag, and tuneful and altogether glorious homecomings by the light of the moon. His were the Olympian days of the sport, when noble squires were its patrons, and every village a home and nursery of stalwart cricketers, before the epoch of special trains, gate money, star 11s, and the tumultuous gathering of idle cads to jabber at a game they cannot play. Concerning a certain lady. This lady wears a blue serge suit and a black hat, without flippancy. She is a powerfully built lady, and generally more or less flushed, and she is aunt, apparently, to a great number of objectionable-looking people. I go in terror of her. Yet the worm will turn at last, and so will the mild, pacific literary man. Her last outrage was too much even for my patience. It was committed at Gloucester Road Station the other afternoon. I was about to get into a train for Wimbledon, and there are only 2 of them to the hour, and so as far as I could see, the whole world was at peace for me. I felt perfectly secure. The aegis of the Pax Britannica, if you will pardon the expression, was over for me. For the moment, the thought of the lady in the blue serge was quite out of my mind. I had just brought a newspaper, and had my hand on the carriage door. The guard was fluttering his flag. Then suddenly she swooped out of space, out of the infinite unknown, and hit me. She always hits me when she comes near me, and I infer she hits everyone she comes across. She hit me this time in the chest with her elbow, and knocked me away from the door handle. She hit me very hard indeed. She was as fierce as I had ever known her. With her there were 2 nieces and a nephew, and the nephew hit me too. He was a horrid little boy in an Eton suit of the kind they do not wear at Eton, and he hit me with his head and pushed at me with his little pink hands. The nieces might have been about 22 and 13 respectively, and I infer that they were apprenticed to her. All 4 people seemed madly excited. "It's just starting!" they screamed, and the train was, indeed, slowly moving. Their object, so far as they had an object and were not animated by mere fury, appeared to be to assault me and then escape in the train. The lady in blue got in and then came backwards out again, sweeping the smaller girl behind her upon the 2 others, who were engaged in hustling me. "It's smoking!" she cried. I could have told her that, if she had asked instead of hitting me. The elder girl, by backing dexterously upon me, knocked my umbrella out of my hand, and when I stooped to pick it up, the little boy knocked my hat off. I will confess they demoralized me with their archaic violence. I had some thought of joining in their wild amuck, whooping, kicking out madly, perhaps assaulting a porter. I think the lady in blue would have been surprised to find what an effective addition to her staff she had picked up. But before I could collect my thoughts sufficiently to do any definite thing, the whole affair was over. A porter was slamming doors on them. The train was running fast out of the station, and I was left alone with an unmannerly newsboy and an unmannerly porter on the platform. I waited until the porter was out of the way, and then I hit the newsboy for laughing at me. But even with that altercation, it was a tedious wait for the next train to Wimbledon. This is the latest of my encounters with this lady, but it has decided me to keep silence no longer. She has been persecuting me now for years in all parts of London. It may be I am her only victim, but on the other hand, she may be in the habit of annoying the entire class of slender and inoffensive young men. If so, and they will communicate with me through the publishers of this little volume, we might do something toward suppressing her. Found an anti-energetic lady league or something of that sort. For if there was ever a crying wrong that clamoured for suppression, it is this violent woman. She is, even now, flagrantly illegal. She might be given in charge for hitting people at any time and be warned or fined or even given a week. But somehow it is only when she is overpast and I am recovering my wits that I recollect that she might be dealt with in this way. She is the chartered libertine of British matrons, and assaulteth where she listeneth. The blows I have endured from her, She fights people who are getting into buses. It is no mere accidental jostling, but a deliberate shouldering, poking with umbrellas, and clawing. It is her delight to go to the Regent Circus corner of Piccadilly about 7:30 in the evening, accompanied by a genteel rout of daughters, and fill up whole omnibuses with them. At that hour there are work girls and tired clerks, and the like worn-out, anemic humanity trying to get home for an hour or so of rest before bed, and they crowd round the buses very eagerly. They are little able to cope with her exuberant vitality, being ill-nourished and tired from the day's work, and she simply mows through them and fills up every vacant place they covet before their eyes. Then I can never count change, even when my mind is tranquil, and she knows that, and swoops threateningly upon me in booking offices and stationers' shops. When I am dodging cabs at crossings, she will appear from behind an omnibus or carriage and butt into me furiously. She holds her umbrella in her folded arms, just as the Punch puppet does his staff, and with as deadly effect. Sometimes she discards her customary navy blue and puts on a glittering bonnet with bead trimmings, and goes and hurts people who are waiting to enter the pit at theatres, and especially to hurt me. She is fond of public shows because they afford such possibilities of hurting me. Once I saw her standing partly on a seat and partly on another lady in the Church of St. George's, Hanover Square, partly, indeed, watching a bride cry, but chiefly, I expect, scheming how she could get round to me and hurt me. Then there was an occasion at the Academy when she was peculiarly aggressive. I was sitting next my lame friend when she marked me. Of course, she came at once and sat right upon us. "Come along, Joan," I heard her say, as I struggled to draw my flattened remains from under her. "This gentleman will make room." My friend was not so entangled, and had escaped on the other side. She noticed his walk. "Oh, don't you get up," she said. "This gentleman," she indicated my convulsive struggles to free myself, "will do that. I did not see that you were a cripple." It may be some of my readers will recognise the lady now. It can be, for the honour of womankind, only one woman. She is an atavism, a survival of the age of violence, a Paleolithic squaw in petticoats. I do not know her name and address, or I would publish it. I do not care if she kills me the next time she meets me, for the limits of endurance have been passed. If she kills me, I shall die a martyr in the cause of the Queen's peace, and if it is only one woman, then it was the same lady, more than half intoxicated, that I saw in the Whitechapel Road, cruelly ill-treating a little costermonger. If it was not she, it was certainly her sister, and I do not care who knows it. What to do with her, I do not know. A league, after all, seems ineffectual. She would break up any league. I have thought of giving her in charge for assault, but I shrink from the invidious publicity of that. Still, I am in grim earnest to do something. I think at times that the compulsory adoption of a narrow doorway for churches and places of public entertainment might be some protection for quiet, inoffensive people. How she would rage outside, to be sure, yet that seems a great undertaking. But this little paper is not so much a plan of campaign as a preliminary defiance. Life is a doubtful boon while one is never safe from assault, from hitting and shoving, from poking with umbrellas, being sat upon and used as a target for projectile nephews and nieces. I warn her, possibly with a certain quaver in my voice, that I am in revolt. If she hits me again, I will not say the precise thing I will do, but I warn her very solemnly and deliberately that she had better not hit me again. And so, for the present, the matter remains. The shopman. If I were really opulent, I would not go into a shop at all. I would have a private secretary. If I were really determined, Euphemia would do these things. As it is, I find buying things in a shop the most exasperating of all the many trying duties of life. I am sometimes almost tempted to declare myself Adamite to escape it. The way the shopman eyes you as you enter his den, the very spread of his fingers irritate me. "What can I have the pleasure?" he says, bowing forward at me and with his eye on my chin, and so waits. Now, I hate incomplete sentences and confound his pleasure. I don't go into a shop to give a shopman pleasure. But your ordinary shopman must needs pretend you delight and amuse him, I say, trying to display my dislike as plainly as possible. "Gloves." "Gloves, yes, sir," he says. Why should he? I suppose he thinks I require to be confirmed in my persuasion that I want gloves. "Calf, kid, dogskin." How shall I know the technicalities of his traffic? "Ordinary gloves," I say, disdaining his petty distinctions. "At what price, sir?" he asks. Now that always maddens me. Why should I be expected to know the price of gloves? I'm not a commercial traveller, nor a wholesale dealer, and I don't look like one. Neither am I constitutionally parsimonious nor petty. I am a literary man, unworldly, and I wear long hair and a soft hat and a peculiar overcoat to indicate the same to ordinary people. Why, I say, should I know the price of gloves? I know they are some ordinary price, 11pence, halfpenny, or 3 and 6, or 7 and 6, or something, or one of those prices that everything is sold at, but further, I don't go. Perhaps I say 11pence, halfpenny at a venture. His face lights up with quiet malice. "Don't keep them, sir," he says. I can tell by his expression that I am ridiculously low, and so being snubbed, I think of trying with 3 and 6, or 7 and 6, the only other probable prices for things that I know except a guinea and £5. Then I see the absurdity of the business, and my anger comes surging up. "Look here," I say as bitterly as possible. "I don't come here to play at guessing games. Never mind your prices. I want some gloves. Get me some." This cows him a little, but very little. "May I ask your size, sir?" he says, a trifle more respectfully. One would think I spent all my time remembering the size of my gloves. However, it is no good resenting it. "It's either 7 or 9, I say, in a tired way. He just begins another question, and then he catches my eye and stops and goes away to obtain some gloves, and I get a breathing space. But why do they keep on with this cross-examination? If I knew exactly what I wanted, description, price, size, I should not go to a shop at all. It would save me such a lot of trouble just to send a cheque to the stores. The only reason why I go into a tradesman's shop is because I don't know what I want exactly. I'm in doubt about the name or the size or the price or the fashion and want a specialist to help me. The only reason for having shopmen instead of automatic machines is that one requires help in buying things. When I want gloves, the shopman ought to understand his business sufficiently well to know better than I do what particular kinds of gloves I ought to be wearing, and what is a fair price for them. I don't see why I should teach him what is in fashion and what is not. A doctor does not ask you what kind of operation you want and what price you will pay for it. But I really believe these outfitter people would let me run about London wearing cotton gloves and a plaid comforter without lifting a finger to prevent me. And, by the by, that reminds me of a scandalous trick these salesmen will play you. Sometimes they have not the thing you want, and then they make you buy other things. I happen to have, through no fault of my own, a very small head, and consequently for one long summer I wore a little boy's straw hat about London with the colours of a Paddington board school, simply because a rascal outfitter hadn't my size in a proper kind of headgear, and induced me to buy the thing by specious representations. He must have known perfectly well it was not what I ought to wear. It seems never to enter into a shopman's code of honour that he ought to do his best for his customer. Since that, however, I have noticed lots of people about who have struck me in a new light as triumphs of the salesman, masterpieces in the art of incongruity, age in the garb of youth, corpulence put off with the size called slendermans, unhappy, gentle, quiet men with ties like oriflammes, breasts like a kingfisher's, and cataclysmal trouser patterns. Even so, if the shopkeeper had his will, should we all be. Those poor withered maiden ladies too, who fill us with a kind of horror with their juvenile curls, their girlish crudity of colouring, their bonnets giddy, tottering, hectic. It overcomes me with remorse to think that I myself have accused them of vanity and folly. It overcomes me with pain to hear the thoughtless laugh aloud after them in the public ways, for they are simply short-sighted, trustful people, the myopic victims of the salesman and saleswoman. The little children jibe at them, pelt even, and somewhere in the world a draper goes unhung. However, the gloves are bought, I select a pair, haphazard, and he pretends to perceive they fit perfectly by putting them over the back of my hand. I make him assure me of the fit, and then buy the pair, and proceed to take my old ones off and put the new on grimly. If they split or the fingers are too long, glove makers have the most erratic conception of the human finger. I have to buy another pair. But the trouble only begins when you have brought your thing. "Nothing more, sir?" he says. "Nothing," I say. "Braces?" he says. "No, thank you," I say. "Collars? Cuffs?" He looks at mine swiftly but keenly and with an unendurable suspicion. He goes on, item after item. Am I in rags that I should endure this thing? And I get sick of my everlasting "no, thank you." The monotony shows up so glaringly against his kaleidoscopic variety. I feel all the unutterable pettiness, the mean want of enterprise of my poor little purchase compared with the Catholic fling he suggests. I feel angry with myself for being thus played upon. Furiously angry with him. No, no, I say. These tie holders are new. He proceeds to show me his infernal tie holders. They prevent the tie puckering, he says with his eye on mine. It's no good. How much? I say. This whets him to further outrage. Look here, my man, I say at last, goaded to it. I came here for gloves. After endless difficulties, I at last induced you to let me have gloves. I have also been intimidated by the most shameful hints and insinuations into buying that beastly tie holder. I'm not a child that I don't know my own needs. Now will you let me go? How much do you want? That usually checks him. The above is a fair specimen of a shopman, a favourable rendering. There are other things they do, but I simply cannot write about them because it irritates me so to think about them. One infuriating manoeuvre is to correct your pronunciation. Another is to make a terrible ado about your name and address, even when it is quite a well-known name. After I have bought things at a shop, I am quite unfit for social intercourse. I have to go home and fume. There was a time when Euphemia would come and discuss my purchase with a certain levity. But on one occasion, some day these shopmen will goad me too far. It's almost my only consolation, indeed, to think what I am going to do when I do break out. There is a salesman somewhere in the world. He is going on his way, and I on mine, who will, I know, prove my last straw. It may be he will read this, amused, recking little of the mystery of fate. Is killing a salesman murder? Like killing a human being? The Book of Curses. Professor Gargoyle, you must understand, has travelled to and fro in the earth, culling flowers of speech, a kind of recording angel he is, but without any sentimental tears. To be plain, he studies swearing. His collection, however, only approaches completeness in the western departments of European language. Going eastward, he found such an appalling and tropical luxuriance of these ornaments as to despair at last altogether of even a representative selection. They do not curse, he says, at door handles and shirt studs and such other trifles as will draw down the meagre discharge of an Occidental, but when they do begin... I hired a promising-looking man at Calcutta, and after a month or so refused to pay his wages. He was unable to get at me with the big knife he carried because the door was locked. So he sat on his hams outside under the veranda from 6:15 in the morning until nearly 10, cursing in one steady, unbroken flow, an astonishing spate of blasphemy. First, he cursed my family, from me along the female line back to Eve, and then, having toyed with me personally for a little while, he started off along the line of my possible posterity to my remotest great-grandchildren. Then he cursed me by this and that. My hand ached taking it down. He was so very rich. It was a perfect anthology of Bengali blasphemy, vivid, scorching, and variegated, not two alike. And then he turned about and dealt with different parts of me. I was really very fortunate in him, yet it was depressing to think that all this was from one man and that there are 600 million people in Asia. Naturally, said the professor, in answer to my question,
These investigations involve a certain element of danger. The first condition of curse collecting is to be unpopular, especially in the East, where commentary swearing alone is practiced, and you have to offend a man very grievously to get him to disgorge his treasure. In this country, except among ladies in comparatively humble circumstances, anything like this fluent, explicit, detailed, and sincere cursing aimed, missile fashion, at a personal enemy is not found. It was quite common a few centuries ago. Indeed, in the Middle Ages, it was part of the recognized procedure. Aggrieved parties would issue a father's curse, an orphan's curse, and so forth, much as we should take out a county court summons. And it played a large part in ecclesiastical policy too. At one time, the entire church militant here on earth was swearing in unison, and the Latin tongue. At the Republic of Venice, a very splendid and imposing spectacle. It seems to me a pity to let these old customs die out so completely. I estimate that more than half these Gothic forms have altogether passed out of memory. There must have been some splendid thing in Erse and Gaelic too, for the Celtic mind, with its more vivid sense of colour, its quicker transitions and deeper emotional quality, has ever overcursed the stolid Teuton. But it's all getting forgotten. Indeed, your common Englishman now scarcely curses at all. A more colourless and conventional affair than what in England is called swearing one can scarcely imagine. It is just common talk with some half-dozen orthodox bad words dropped in here and there in the most foolish and illogical manner. Fancy having orthodox, unorthodox words. I remember one day getting into a third-class smoking carriage on the Metropolitan Railway about 1 o'clock and finding it full of rough working men. Everything they said was seasoned with one incredibly stupid adjective, and no doubt they thought they were very desperate characters. At last I asked them not to say that word again. One forthwith asked me, "What the—" I really cannot quote these puerilities, what the idiotic cliché that mattered to me, so I looked at him quietly over my glasses, and I began. It was a revelation to these poor fellows. They sat open-mouthed, gasping. Then those that were nearest to me began to edge away, and at the very next station they all bundled out of the carriage before the train stopped, as though I had some infectious disease. And the thing was just a rough, imperfect rendering of some mere commonplaces, passing the time of day, as it were, which the heathen of Aleppo used to favour the servants of the American missionary. Indeed, said Professor Gargoyle, if it were not for women, there would be nothing in England that one could speak of as swearing at all.
I say, said I, is that not rather rough on the ladies?
Not at all. They have agreed to consider certain words, for no very good reason, bad words. It is a pure convention. It has little or nothing to do with the actual meaning, because for every one of these bad words there is a paraphrase or synonym considered to be quite suitable for polite ears. Hence, the feeblest creature can always produce a sensation by breaking the taboo. But women are learning how to undo this error of theirs. The word damn, for instance, is, I hear, being admitted freely into the boudoir and feminine conversation. It is even considered a rather prudish thing to object to this word. Now, men, especially feeble men, hate doing things that women do. As a consequence, men who go about saying damn are now regarded by their fellow men as only a shade less effeminate than those who go about saying nasty and horrid. The subtler sex will not be long in noticing what has happened to this objectionable word. When they do, they will, of course, forthwith take up all the others. It will be a little startling perhaps at first, but in the end there will be no swearing left. I have no doubt there will be those who will air their petty wit on the pioneer women, but where a martyr is wanted, a woman can always be found to offer herself. She will clothe herself in cursing like the ungodly and perish in that Nessus shirt, a martyr to pure language. And then, this dull cad swearing, a mere unnecessary affectation of coarseness will disappear, and a very good job too. There is a pretty department of the subject which I might call grace swearing. "Odds fish," cried the king when he saw the man climbing Salisbury Spire. "He shall have a patent for it. No one else shall do it. One might call such little things Wardour Street curses. Odds bodkins is a ladylike form, and odds posels a variety I met in the British Museum. Every gentleman once upon a time aspired to have his own particular grace curse, just as he liked to have his crest, and his bookplate, and his characteristic signature. It fluttered pleasantly into his conversation as Mr. Whistler's butterfly comes into his pictures, a signature and a delight. Odds butterfly, I have sometimes thought of a little book of grace words with heraldic curses, printed with wide margins on the best of paper. Its covers should be of soft red leather, stamped with little gold flowers. It might be made a birthday book or a pocket diary. Daily invocations. Coming back to rather swearing, I must confess I am sorry to see it decay. It was such a thoroughly hygienic and moral practice. You see, if anything annoying happens to a man, or if any powerful emotion seizes him, his brain, under the irritation, begins to disengage energy at a tremendous rate. He has to use all his available force of control in keeping the energy in. Some of it will leak away into the nerves of his face and distort his features. Some may set his tear glands at work. Some may travel down his vagus nerve and inhibit his heart's action so that he faints, or upset the blood vessels in his head and give him a stroke. Or, if he pens it up, without it reaching any of these vents, it may rise at last to flood level, and you will have violent assaults, the breaking of furniture, murder even. For all this energy, a good, flamboyant, ranting swear is nature's outlet. All primitive men and most animals swear. It is an emotional shunt. Your cat swears at you because she does not want to scratch your face, and the horse, because he cannot swear, drops dead. So you see my reason for regretting the decay of this excellent and most unwholesome practice. However, I must be getting on. Just now I am travelling about London, paying cabmen their legal fares. Sometimes one picks up a new variant, though much of it is merely stereo. And with that, flinging a playful curse at me, he disappeared at once into the tobacco smoke from which I had engendered him. An amusing and cheerful person on the whole, though I will admit his theme was a little undesirable. Dunstone's Dear Lady. The story of Dunstone is so slight, so trivial in its cardinal incidents, such a business of cheap feathers and bits of ribbon on the surface, that I should hesitate to tell it, were it not for its inwardness, what one might call the symbolism of the thing. Frankly, I do not clearly see what that symbolism is, but
I feel it hovering in some indefinable way whenever I recall his case. It is one of those things that make a man extend his arm and twiddle his fingers and say, blinking, like that, you know? So do not imagine for one moment that this is a shallow story simply because it is painted, so to speak, not in heart's blood, but in table claret. Dunstone was a strong, quiet kind of man, a man of conspicuous mediocrity, and rising rapidly, therefore, in his profession. He was immensely industrious and a little given to melancholia in private life. He smoked rather too many cigars and took his social occasions seriously. He dressed faultlessly, with a scrupulous elimination of style. Unlike Mr. Grant Allen's ideal man, he was not constitutionally a lover. Indeed, he seemed not to like the ordinary girl at all, found her either too clever or too shallow. Lacking a something. I don't think he knew quite what it was. Neither do I. It is a case for extended hand and twiddling fingers. Moreover, I don't think the ordinary girl took to Dunstone very much. He suffered, I fancy, from a kind of mental greyness. He was all subtle tones. The laughter of girls jarred upon him. Foolish smartness or amiable foolishness got on his nerves. He detested, with equal sincerity, bright dressing, artistic dabbling, piety, and the glow of health. And when, as his confidential friend, confidential, that is, so far as his limits allowed, I heard that he intended to marry, I was really very much surprised. I expected something quintessential. I was surprised to find she was a visiting governess. Haringey, the artist, thought there was nothing in her, but Sackbut, the art critic, was inclined to admire her bones. For my own part, I took rather a liking to her. She was small and thin, and to be frank, I think it was because she hardly got enough to eat of the delicate food that she needed. She was shabby, too, dressed in rusty mourning. She had recently lost her mother. But she had a sweet, low voice, a shrinking manner, rather a graceful carriage, I thought, and, though she spoke rarely, all she said was sweet and sane. She struck me as a refined woman in a blatant age. The general effect of her upon me was favourable. Upon Dunstone, it was tremendous. He lost a considerable proportion of his melancholia, and raved at times like a common man. He called her, in particular, his dear lady, and his sweet thing. Things I find eloquent of what he found in her. What that was, I fancy, I understand, and yet I cannot say it quite. One has to resort to the extended arm and fingers vibratile. Before he married her, which he did while she was still in half-mourning, there was anxiety about her health, and I understood she needed air and exercise and strengthening food. But she recovered rapidly after her marriage. Her eyes grew brighter. We saw less of Sackbut's delicious skeleton, and then, in the strangest way, she began to change. It is none of my imagining. I have heard the change remarked upon by 6 independent observers. Yet you would think a girl of 23, as she certainly was, had attained her development as a woman. I have heard her compared to a winter's bud, cased in its sombre scales until the sun shone, and the warm, moist winds began to blow. I noticed first that the delicate outline of her cheek was filling, and then came the time when she reverted to colour in her dress. Her first essays were charitably received. Her years of struggle, her year of mourning, had no doubt dwarfed her powers in this direction. Presently, her natural good taste would reassert itself. But the next effort and the next were harder to explain. It was not the note of nervousness or inexperience we saw. There was an undeniable decision, and not a token of shame. The little black winter bud grew warm-coloured above and burst suddenly into extravagant outlines and chromatic confusion. Haringey, who is a cad, first put what we were all feeling into words. "I've just seen Dunstone and his donor," he said. Clearly she was one of those rare women who cannot dress, and that was not all. A certain buoyancy, hitherto unsuspected, crept into her manner as the corpuscles multiplied in her veins, an archness. She talked more and threw up a spray of playfulness. And with a growing energy she began to revise the exquisite aesthetic balance of Dunstan's house. She even enamelled a chair. For a year or so I was in the East. When I returned, Mrs. Dunstone amazed me. In some odd way she had grown. She had positively grown. She was taller, broader, brighter, infinitely brighter. She wore a diamond brooch in the afternoon. The delicious skeleton had vanished in plumpness. She moved with emphasis. Her eye, which glittered, met mine bravely, and she talked as one who would be heard. In the old days you saw nothing but a rare timid glance from under the pretty lids. She talked now of this and of that, and of people of good family, and the difficulty of getting a suitable governess for her little boy. She said she objected to meeting people.
One would not care to invite to one's house.
She swamped me with tea and ruled the conversation, so that Dunstone and I, who were once old friends, talked civil twaddle for the space of 1 hour. Theatres, concerts, and assemblies chiefly, and then parted again. The furniture had all been altered. There were 2 cosy nooks in the room after the recipe in The Born Lady. It was plain to me, it is plain to everyone, I find, that Mrs. Dunstone is, in the sun of prosperity, rapidly developing an extremely florid vulgarity. And afterwards I discovered that she had forgotten her music and evidently enjoyed her meals. Yet I, for one, can witness that 5 years ago there was that about her. I can only extend my arm with quivering digits. But it was something very sweet and dainty, something that made her white and thoughtful, and marked her off from the rest of womankind. I sometimes fancy it may have been anemia in my part, but it was certainly poverty and mourning in the main. You may think that this is a story of disillusionment. When I first heard the story, I thought so too. But so far as Dunstone goes, that is not the case. It is rare that I see him now, but the other day we smoked 2 cigars apiece together, and in a moment of confidence he spoke of her. He said how anxious he felt for her health, called her his dainty little lady, and spoke of the coarseness of other women. I'm afraid this is not a very eventful story, and yet there is that very convenient gesture. An arm protruded and flickering fingers conveys my meaning best. Perhaps you will understand. Euphemia's new entertainment. Euphemia has great ideas of putting people at their ease. 1,000 little devices for thawing the very stiffest among them with a home-like glow. Far be it from me to sing her praises, but I must admit that at times she is extremely successful in this, and at times almost too successful. That tea cake business, for instance. No doubt it is a genial expedient to make your guest toast his own tea cake. Down he must go upon his knees upon your hearthrug, and his poses will melt away like the dews of the morning before the rising sun. Nevertheless, when it comes to roasting a gallant veteran like Major Augustus, deliberately roasting him in spite of the facts that he has served his country nobly through 30 irksome years of peace, and that he admires Euphemia with a delicate fervour, roasting him, I say, alive as if it were a Strasbourg goose, or suddenly affixing a delicate young genius to the hither end of a toasting fork while he is in the midst of a really subtle and tender conversation. The limits of social warmth seem to be approaching dangerously near. However, this scarcely concerns Euphemia's new entertainment. This new entertainment is modelling in clay. Euphemia tells me it is to be quite the common thing this winter. It is intended especially for the evening after a little dinner. As the reader is aware, the evening after a little dinner is apt to pall. A certain placid contentment creeps over people. I don't know in what organ originality resides, but it is a curious thing, and one I must leave to the consideration of psychologists. That people's output of original remarks appears to be obstructed in some way after these gastronomic exercises. Then a little dinner always confirms my theory of the absurdity of polygonal conversation. Music and songs, too, have their drawbacks, especially gay songs. They invariably evoke a vaporous melancholy. Card-playing, Euphemia objects to because her uncle, the Dean, is prominent in connection with some ridiculous association for the suppression of gambling, and in what are called games, no rational creature esteeming himself as immortal soul would participate. In this difficulty it was that Euphemia decided, I fancy, by the possession of certain really very becoming aprons, took upon this business of clay modelling. You have a lump of greyish clay and a saucer of water and certain small tools of wood, for which I cannot discover the slightest use in the world given you, and Euphemia puts on a very winning bib. Then, moistening the clay until it acquires sufficient plasticity, and incidentally, splashing your cuffs and coat sleeves with an agreeably light tinted mud, you set to work. At first, people are a little disgusted at the apparent dirtiness of the employment, and also, perhaps, rather diffident. The eldest lady says weakly deprecatory things, and the feeblest male is jocular after his wont. But it is remarkable how soon the charm of this delightful occupation seizes hold of you. For really the sensations of moulding this plastic matter into shape are wonderfully and quite unaccountably pleasing. It is ever so much easier than drawing things. Anyone can do it, as the advertisement people say, and the work is so much more substantial in its effects. Technical questions arise. In moulding a head, do you take a lump and fine it down, or do you dab on the features after the main knob of it is shaped? So soon as your guests realized the plastic possibilities before them, a great silence, a delicious absorption comes over them. Some rash person states that he is moulding an Apollo, or a vase, or a bust of Mr. Gladstone, or an elephant or some such animal. The wiser one goes to work in a speculative spirit, aiming secretly at this perhaps, but quite willing to go on with that if Providence so wills it. Buddhas are good subjects. There is a certain genial rotundity not difficult to attain, and the pyramidal build of the idol is well suited to the material. You can start a Buddha and hedge to make it a loaf of bread if the features are unsatisfactory. For slender objects, a skeletal substructure of bent hairpins or matches is advisable. The innate egotism of the human animal becomes very conspicuous.
"His tail is too large," says the lady with the fish in self-criticism.
"I haven't put his tail on yet, that is his trunk," answers the young man with the elephant. It's a pretty sight to see the first awakening of the artistic passion in your guests, the flush of discovery, the glow of innocent pride as the familiar features of Mr. Gladstone emerge from the bust of Clytie. An incidental stroke of the thumbnail develops new marvels of expression. By the by, it is just as well to forbid deliberate attempts at portraiture. And I know no more becoming expression for everyone than the look of intent and pleasing effort, a divine touch almost that comes over the common man modelling. For my own part, I feel a being infinitely my own superior when I get my fingers upon the clay. And incidentally, how much pleasanter this is than writing articles to see the work grow altogether under your hands, to begin with the large masses and finish with the details, as every artist should. Just to show how easy the whole thing is, I append a little sketch of the first work I ever did. I had positively no previous instruction. Unfortunately, the left ear of the animal, a cat, by the by, has fallen off. The figure to the left is the back view of a Buddha. However, I have said enough to show the charm of the new amusement. It will prove a boon to many a troubled hostess. The material is called modelling clay, and one may buy it of any dealer in artist materials, several pounds for sixpence. This has to be renewed at intervals, as a good deal is taken away by the more careless among your guests upon their clothes. For freedom of spelling, the discovery of an art. It is curious that many people do not grumble more at having to spell correctly. Yet one may ask, do we not a little overestimate the value of orthography? This is a natural reflection enough when the maker of artless happy phrases has been ransacking the dictionary for some elusive wretch of a word which in the end proves to be not yet naturalised or technical or a mere local vulgarity. Yet one does not often hear the idea canvassed in polite conversation. Dealers in small talk of the less prolific kind are continually falling back upon the silk hat or dress suit, or some rule of etiquette or other convention as a theme, but spelling seems to escape them. The suspicion seems quaint, but one may almost fancy that an allusion to spelling savoured a little of indelicacy. It must be admitted, though, where the scruples come from would be hard to say, that there is a certain diffidence even here in broaching my doubts in the matter. For some inexplicable reason, spelling has become mixed up with moral feeling. One cannot pretend to explain things in a little paper of this kind. The fact is so. Spelling is not appropriate or inappropriate, elegant or inelegant. It is right or wrong. We do not greatly blame a man for turn-down collars when the vogue is erect, nor, in these liberal days, for theological eccentricity. But we esteem him nothing, an outcast, if he but drop a pea from opportunity. It is not an anecdote, but a scandal if we say a man cannot spell his own name. There is only one thing esteemed worse before we come to the deadly crimes, and that is the softening of language by dropping the aspirate. After all, it is an unorthodox age. We are all horribly afraid of being bourgeoisie, and unconventionality is the ideal of every respectable person. It is strange that we should cling so steadfastly to correct spelling. Yet again, one can partly understand the business if one thinks of the little ways of your schoolmaster and schoolmistress. This sanctity of spelling is stamped upon us in our earliest years. The writer recalls a period of youth wherein 6 hours a week was given to the study of spelling, and 4 hours to all other religious instruction. So important is it that a writer who cannot spell is almost driven to abandon his calling, however urgent the thing he may have to say, or his need of the incidentals of fame. Yet, in the crisis of such a struggle, rebellious thoughts may arise. Even this, why after all should correct spelling be the one absolutely essential literary merit? For it is less fatal for an ambitious scribe to be as dull as Hoxton than to spell in diverse ways. Yet correct spelling of English has not been traced to revelation. There was no grammatical Sinai, with a dictionary instead of tables of stone. Indeed, we do not even know certainly when correct spelling began, which word in the language was first spelt the right way, and by whom. Correct spelling may have been evolved, or it may be the creation of some mastermind. Its inventor, if it had an inventor, is absolutely forgotten. Thomas Cobbett would have invented it, but that he was born more than 2 centuries too late, poor man. All that we certainly know is that contemporaneously with the rise of extreme Puritanism, the belief in orthography first spread among Elizabethan printers. And with the Hanoverian succession, the new doctrine possessed the whole length and breadth of the land. At that time, the world passed through what extension lecturers call, for no particular reason, the classical epoch. Nature, as indeed all the literature manuals testify, was in the remotest background then of human thought. The human mind, in a mood of the severest logic, brought everything to the touchstone of an orderly reason. The conception of correctness dominated all mortal affairs. For instance, one's natural hair with its vagaries of rat-tails, duck-tails, errant curls and baldness gave place to an orderly wig, or was at least decently powdered. The hoop remedied the deficiencies of the feminine form, and the gardener clipped his yews into respectability. All poetry was written to one measure in those days, and a Royal Academy with a lady member was inaugurated that art might become at least decent. Dictionaries began. The crowning glory of Hanoverian literature was a great lexicographer. In those days, it was believed that the spelling of every English word had been settled for all time. Thence to the present day, though the severities then inaugurated, so far as metre and artistic composition are concerned, been generously relaxed. though we have had a Whistler, a Walt Whitman, and a Wagner, the rigours of spelling have continued unabated. There is just one right way of spelling, and all others are held to be not simply inelegant or undesirable, but wrong and unorthodox spelling, like original morality goes hand in hand with shame. Yet, even at the risk of shocking the religious convictions of some, may not one ask whether spelling is in truth a matter of right and wrong at all? Might it not rather be an art? Is it too much to advocate the indiscriminate sacking of the alphabet? But yet it seems plausible that there is a happy medium between a reckless debauch of errant letters and our present-day rigidity. For some words, at any rate, may there not be sometimes one way of spelling a little happier, sometimes another? We do something of this sort even now with our fantasy and fantasy, and we might do more. How one would spell this word or that would become, if this latitude was conceded, a subtle anxiety of the literary exquisite. People are scarcely prepared to realize what shades of meaning may be got by such a simple device. Let us take a simple instance. You write, let us say, to all your cousins, many of your friends, and even, it may be, to this indifferent intimate and that familiar enemy, my dear so-and-so. But at times you feel, even as you write, sometimes, that there is something too much and sometimes something lacking. You may even get so far in the right way occasionally as to write, my dear so-and-so, when your heart chills. And people versed in the arts of social intercourse know the subtle insult of misspelling a person's name, or flicking it off flippantly with a mere waggling wipe of the pen. But these are mere beginnings. Let the reader take a pen in hand and sit down and write, my very dear wife. Clean, cold, and correct this is, speaking of orderly affection, settled and stereotyped long ago. In such letters is butcher's meat also very dear. Try now, my very dear wife. Is it not immediately, infinitely more soft and tender? Is there not something exquisitely pleasant in lingering over those redundant letters, leaving each word, as it were, with a reluctant caress? Such spelling is a soft, domestic, lovingly wasteful use of material. Or, again, if you have no wife or object to an old-fashioned conjugal tenderness, try me own sweet dearest Marie. There is the tremble of a tenderness no mere arrangement of trim everyday letters can express in those double R's. Sweetie? My lady must be sweet. Why, pump water and inferior champagne. Spirits of nitrous ether and pancreatic juice are sweet. For my own part, I always spell so, with lots of F's and G's and such like taily, twirly, loopy things when my heart is in the tender vein. And I hold that a man who will not do so now he has been shown how to do it is, in plain English, neither more nor less than a prig. The advantages of a varied spelling of names are very great. Industrious rather than intelligent, people have not given a little time, and such minds as they have, to the discussion of the right spelling of our great poet's name. But he himself never dreamt of tying himself down to one presentation of himself, and was, we have his hand for it, Shakespeare, 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 and so forth, as the mood might be. It would be almost as reasonable to debate whether Shakespeare smiled or frowned. My dear friend Simonogs is the same. He is Sims, a mere slash of the pen to those he scorns, Simmons or Simongs to his familiar, and Simmons, 80 Simmons Esquire, to all Europe. From such mere introductory departures from precision, such petty escapades as these, we might seduce the reader into an utter debauch of spelling. But a sudden Maenad dance of the letters on the page, gleeful and iridescent spelling, a wild rush and procession of howling vowels and clattering consonants might startle the half-won reader back into orthodoxy. Besides, there is another reader, the printer's reader, to consider. For if an author let his wit run to these matters, he might write elaborate, marginal exhortations to this authority, begging his mercy to let the little flowers of spelling alone. Else the plough of that Philistine's uniformity will utterly root them out. Such high art of spelling, as is thus hinted at, is an art that is still to gather confidence and brave the light of publicity. A few, indeed, practice it secretly for love, in letters and on spare bits of paper. But, for the most part, people do not know that there is so much as an art of spelling possible. The tyranny of orthography lies so heavily on the land. Your common editors and their printers are a mere orthodox spelling police, and at the least they rigorously blot out all the delightful frolics of your artist in spelling before his writings reach the public eye. But commonly, as I have proved again and again, the slightest lapse into rococo spelling is sufficient to secure the rejection of a manuscript without further ado. And to end, a word about phonographers. It may be that my title had led the reader to anticipate some mention of these before. They are a kind of religious sect, a heresy from the orthodox spelling. They bind one another by their mysteries and a 5-shilling subscription in a society to introduces an improved method of spelling. They come across the artistic vision, they and their society, with an altogether indefinable offence. Perhaps the essence of it is the indescribable meanness of their motive, for this phonography really amounts to a study of the cheapest way of spelling words. These phonographers are sweaters of the Queen's English, living meanly on the salvage of honest mental commerce by clipping the coin of thought. But enough of them. They are mentioned here only to be disavowed. They would substitute one narrow orthodoxy for another, and I would unfold the banner of freedom. Spell, my brethren, as you will awake. Arise, O language, living in chains. Let butter spelling be our Bastille. So, with a prophetic vision of liberated words pouring out of the dungeons of a spelling book, this plea for freedom concludes. What trivial arguments there are for a uniform spelling, I must leave the reader to discover. There is no place to carp against liberation, I foresee, with the glow of the dawn in my eyes. Incidental thoughts on a bald head. I was asked to go quite suddenly, and found myself there before I had time to think of what it might be. I understood her to say it was a meeting of some Sunday society, some society that tried to turn the Sabbath from a day of woe to a day of rejoicing. St. George's Hall, Langham Place, a cab, and there we were. I thought they would be picturesque pagans, but the entertainment was the oddest it has ever been my lot to see, a kind of mystery. The place was dark except for a big circle of light on a screen, and a dismal man with a long stick was talking about the effects of alcohol on your muscles. He talked, and people went to sleep all about us. Euphemia's face looked so very pretty in the dim light that I tried to talk to her and hold her hand, but she only said, "Shh." And then they began showing pictures on the screen. The most shocking things. Stomachs and all that kind of thing. They went on like that for an hour, and then there was a lot of thumping with umbrellas, and they turned the lights up, and we went home. Curious way of spending Sunday afternoon, is it not? But you may imagine I had a dismal time all that hour. I understood the people about me were sceptics, the kind of people who don't believe things a singular class, and I am told a growing one. These excellent people, it seems, have conscientious objections to going to chapel or church, but at the same time the devotional habit of countless generations of pious forerunners is strong in them. Consequently, they have invented things like these lectures to go to, with a professor instead of a priest, and a lantern slide of a stomach by way of altarpiece. And alcohol, they make their devil, and their god is hygiene. A curious and instructive case of mental inertia. I understand, too, there are several other temples of this cult in London. South Place Chapel and Essex Hall, for instance, where they worship the spirit of the innermost. But the thing that struck me so oddly was the number of bald heads glimmering faintly in the reflected light from the lantern circle. And that set me thinking upon a difficulty I have never been able to surmount. You see, these people, and lots of other people too, believe in a thing they call natural selection. They think, as part of that belief, that men are descended from hairy simian ancestors, assert that even 100,000 years ago the ancestor was hairy, heavy, and almost as much a brute as if he lived in Mr. Arthur Morrison's Whitechapel. For my own part, I think it is a pretty theory, and would certainly accept it were if not for one objection. The thing I cannot understand is how our ancestor lost that hair. I see no reason why he should not have kept his hair on. According to the theory of natural selection, materially favourable variations survive, unfavourable disappear. The only way in which the loss is to be accounted for is by explaining it as advantageous. But where is the advantage of losing your hair? The disadvantages appear to me to be innumerable. A thick covering of hair, like that of a capuchin monkey, would be an invaluable protection against sudden changes of temperature, far better than any clothing can be. Had I that, for instance, I should be rid of perpetual cold in the head that so disfigures my life, and the multitudes who die annually of chills, bronchitis, and consumption, and most of those who suffer from rheumatic pains, neuralgia, and so forth would not so die and suffer. And in the past, when clothing was less perfect and faring a casual commodity, the disadvantage of losing hair were all the greater. In very hot countries, Hair is perhaps even more important in saving the possessor from the excessive glare of the sun. Before the invention of the hat, thick hair on the head, at least, was absolutely essential to save the owner of the skull from sunstroke. That perhaps explains why the hair has been retained there, and why it is going now that we have hats, but it certainly does not explain why it has gone from the rest of the body. One remarkably weak explanation has been propounded, an appeal to our belief in human vanity. He picked it out by the roots because he thought he was prettier without. But that is no reason at all. Suppose he did. It would not affect his children. Professor Weismann has at least convinced scientific people of this, that the characters acquired by a parent are rarely, if ever, transmitted to its offspring. An individual given to such wanton denudation would simply be at a disadvantage with his decently covered fellows, would fall behind in the race of life, and perish with his kind. Besides, if man has been at such pains to uncover his skin, why have quite a large number of the most respected among us such a passionate desire to have it covered up again? Yet that is the only attempted explanation I have ever come upon, and the thing has often worried me. I think it is just as probable a change in dietary. I have noticed that most of your vegetarians are shock-headed, ample, bearded men, and I have heard the ancestor was vegetarian. Or it may be, I sometimes fancy, a kind of inherent disposition on the part of your human animal to dwindle. That came back in my memory vividly as I looked at the long rows of skeptics, typical advanced people, and marked their glistening crania. I recalled other losses. Here is humanity, thought I, growing hairless, growing bald, growing toothless, unemotional, irreligious, losing the end joint of the little toe, dwindling in its osseous structures, its jawbone and brow ridges, losing all the full, rich curvatures of its primordial beauty. It seems almost like what the scientific people call a law, and by strenuous efforts the creature just keeps pace with its losses, devises clothes, wigs, artificial teeth, paddings, shoes, what civilized being could use his bare feet for his ordinary locomotion. Imagine him on a fur-sprinkled golf links. Then stays an efficient substitute for the effete feminine backbone. So the thing goes on. Long ago his superficies became artificial, and now the human being shrinks like a burning cigar, and the figure he has abandoned remains distended with artificial ashes, dead, dry protections against the exposures he so unaccountably fears. Will he go on shrinking, I wonder? Become at last a mere lurking atomy in his own recesses, a kind of hermit crab, the bulk of him a complex mechanism, a thing of rags and tatters and papier-mâché, stolen from the earth and the plant world and his fellow beasts? And at last may he not disappear altogether, none missing him, and a democracy of honest machinery, neatly clad and loaded up with sound principles of action, walk to and fro in a regenerate world. Thus it was my mind went dreaming in St. George's Hall. But presently, as I say, came the last word about stomachs, and the bald men woke up, rattled their umbrellas, said it was vastly interesting, and went toddling off home in an ecstasy of advanced liberalism. And we, too, returned to the place whence we came. Of a book unwritten. Accomplished literature is all very well in its way, no doubt, but much more fascinating to the contemplative man are the books that have not been written. These latter are no trouble to hold. There are no pages to turn over. One can read them in bed on sleepless nights without a candle. Turning to another topic, primitive man in the works of the descriptive anthropologist is certainly a very entertaining and quaint person. But the man of the future, if we only had the facts, would appeal to us more strongly. Yet where are the books? As Ruskin has said somewhere apropos of Darwin, is it not what man has been, but what he will be, that should interest us? The contemplative man, in his easy chair, pondering this saying, suddenly beholds in the fire, through the blue haze of his pipe, one of these great unwritten volumes. It is large in size, heavy in lettering, seemingly by one Professor Holzkopf, presumably professor at Weizsäcker. The necessary characters of the man of the remote future, deduced from the existing stream of tendency, is the title. The worthy professor is severely scientific in his method, and deliberate and cautious in his deductions. The contemplative man discovers as he pursues his theme, and yet the conclusions are, to say the least, remarkable. We must figure the excellent professor expanding the matter at great length, voluminously technical, but the contemplative man, since he has access to the only copy, is clearly at liberty to make such extracts and abstracts as he chooses for the unscientific reader. Here, for instance, is something of practicable lucidity that he considers admits of quotation. The theory of evolution, writes the professor, is now universally accepted by zoologists and botanists, and it is applied unreservedly to a man. Some question, indeed, whether it fits his soul, but all agree it accounts for his body. Man, we are assured, is descended from ape-like ancestors, molded by circumstances into men, and these apes again were derived from ancestral forms of a lower order. And so, up from the primordial protoplasmic jelly. Clearly then, man, unless the order of the universe has come to an end, will undergo further modification in the future, and at last cease to be man, giving rise to some other type of animated being. At once, the fascinating questions arise. What will this being be? Let us consider for a little the plastic influences at work upon our species. Just as the bird is the creature of the wing and is all molded and modified to flying, and just as the fish is the creature that swims and has had to meet the inflexible conditions of a problem in hydrodynamics, so man is the creature of the brain. He will live by intelligence and not by physical strength, if he live at all. So, that much that is purely animal about him is being, and must be, beyond all question, suppressed in his ultimate development. Evolution is no mechanical tendency making for perfection. According to the ideas current in the year of grace 1897, it is simple, the continual adaptation of plastic life for good or evil to the circumstance that surrounds it. We notice this decay of the animal part around us now, in the loss of teeth and hair, in the dwindling hands and feet of men, in their smaller jaws and slighter mouths and ears. Man does not, by wit
and machinery and verbal agreement what he once did by bodily toil. For once he had to catch his dinner, capture his wife, run away from his enemies, and continually exercise himself for love of himself to perform these duties well. But now all this is changed. Cabs, trains, trams render speed unnecessary. The pursuit of food becomes easier. His wife is no longer hunted, but rather, in view of the crowded matrimonial market, seeks him out. One needs wits now to live, and physical activity is a drug, a snare even. It seeks artificial outlets and overflows in games. Athleticism takes up time and cripples a man in his competitive examinations and in business. So is your fleshy man handicapped against his subtler brother. He is unsuccessful in life, does not marry. The better adapted survive.
The coming man, then, will clearly have a larger brain and a slighter body than the present. But the professor makes one exception to this.
The human hand, since it is the teacher and interpreter of the brain, will become constantly more powerful and subtle as the rest of the musculature dwindles.
Then, in the physiology of these children of men with their expanding brains, their great sensitive hands and diminishing bodies, great changes were necessarily worked.
We see now,
says the professor,
in the more intellectual sections of humanity, an increasing sensitiveness to its stimulants, a growing inability to grapple with such a matter as alcohol, for instance. No longer can men drink a bottle full of port. Some cannot drink tea. It is too exciting for their highly wrought nervous systems. The process will go on, and the Sir Wilfrid Lawson of some near generation may find it his duty and pleasure to mix the silver spray of his wisdom tintinnabulate against the tea tray. These facts lead naturally to the comprehension of others. Fresh raw meat was once a dish for a king. Now refined persons scarcely touch meat unless it is cunningly disguised. Again, consider the case of turnips. The raw root is now a thing almost uneatable. But once upon a time, a turnip must have been a rare and fortunate find, to be torn up with delirious eagerness and devoured in ecstasy. The time will come when the change will affect all the other fruits of the earth. Even now, only the young of mankind eat apples raw. The young always preserving ancestral characteristics after their disappearance in the adult. Some days even boys will regard apples without emotion. The boy of the future, one must believe, will gaze on an apple with the same unspeculative languor with which he now regards a flint, in the absence of a cat. Furthermore, fresh chemical discoveries come into action as modified influences upon men. In the prehistoric period even, man's mouth had ceased to be an instrument for grasping food. It is still growing continually less prehensile. His front teeth are smaller, his lips thinner and less muscular. He has a new organ, a mandible not of irreparable tissue, but of bone and steel. A knife and fork. There is no reason why things should stop at partial artificial division thus afforded. There is every reason, on the contrary, to believe my statement that some cunning exterior mechanism will presently masticate and insalivate his dinner, relieve his diminishing salivary glands and teeth, and at last altogether abolish them.
Then what is not needed disappears. What use is there for external ears, nose, and brow ridges now? The two latter once protected the eye from injury in conflict and in falls, but in these days we keep on our legs and at peace. Directing his thoughts in this way, the reader may presently conjure up a dim, strange vision of the latter-day face.
Eyes large, lustrous, beautiful, soulful. Above them, no longer separated by rugged brow ridges, is the top of the head, a glistening hailstone. Turret and beautiful. No craggy nose rises to disturb